This eerie horror tale revolves around a young woman named Grace, who is an optometrist at a local hospital. While at work, she encounters a patient suffering from severe retinopathy that requires immediate attention. Realizing she might need help with this patient, Grace approaches Dr. Chan, a fellow colleague, to take over this case. Later that day, Grace reaches her home where she lives with her pet cat, Mr. Moo, and from a dimly lit desk, she emails the elderly couple about John's agreement to handle their case. But just then, the lights go out and her peaceful evening is interrupted by unusual noises. Now, Grace gets up and starts scanning the house, and she stops to look at what looks like a picture of her and her cousin. But just then we see her reflection in the mirror. Stand still while Grace moves around. Right at that moment, she gets an unexpected phone call from Detective Harris, who informs her that her brother Michael has committed suicide in Scotland. However, the officials are still looking into whether Michael's death was a murder or suicide. In the next scene, Grace travels to Scotland where she's greeted by Detective Harris. She finds out that Michael was a priest of an extremist religious cult that adhered to the most extreme readings of the Bible. Soon, Harris drives her to the monastery, updating her on the events along the way. He further reveals that the body of a priest was also discovered in the monastery. This implies that Michael murdered the priest before taking his own life. Grace, on the other hand, claims that her brother is not insane and would never kill himself or anybody else. Soon after, they arrive at the convent and meet Mother Superior, who is the leader of the nuns. Mother Superior informs Grace that Michael was a man of faith until the darkness overtook him and caused him to commit sins. However, Grace, who is an atheist, does not accept this and believes her brother was killed. Then, as Grace enters the monastery, it is shown that Mother Superior is clutching a cross and her hands are bleeding. After that, Harris leads Grace to the crime site, which is at the top of a church. He admits that the Vatican State has control over the entire convent area, and they own it. Grace immediately rushes to check on Michael's body and sobs like a child when she sees him. Just then, she sees Michael's ghost, who advises her to leave because it is unsafe for her. She then gets a flashback to when she and Michael were children and were trapped in a storm. Michael was helping her at the time, and he said the same thing he did just now. In the next scene, Grace awakens in a hospital and a nun administers sedatives to her. Moments later, a newly assigned priest at the monastery named Father Romero enters the room and asks about her well-being. He asks whether Grace has a family to accompany her, but her mother is already dead, and her father is in prison for murdering her mother. Grace then expresses her concern that there was no sand on Michael's body or in his hair, although he had fallen on the beach. However, Father Romero discloses that Mother Superior had cleansed Michael's body before handing it over to the authorities. He then tells her not to worry, because they will do a thorough and impartial investigation. Sometime later, Grace drives a car from the hospital to the other side of the beach. She arrives at the location where her brother's body was discovered. But just then, she has another vision in which she sees all the nuns falling to their deaths from the old tomb. This actually frightens Grace, and she passes out and falls into the ocean. However, moments later, a driver notices her and saves her. In the next scene, we see Grace waking up in the convent dressed as a nun. She now starts getting irritated because everything around her is weird, and she suspects Mother Superior is behind all of this. Then Grace exits the room and discovers all of the nuns walking down the corridor. As the sisters prepare to have lunch, Mother Superior leads a prayer, and this time, Grace accuses her of concealing evidence regarding her brother's death. She then demands her clothes and her phone because she needs to make an urgent phone call. However, Mother Superior tells Grace that her phone was lost in the sea and her clothes are in the laundry. Just then, Father Romero arrives and calms her down. He then takes her to the top of the church and shows her the confessional spot. Eris reveals that this convent was once on the pilgrimage path for the Knights of the Morning Star. They were guarding relics and artifacts because they felt the relics possessed dark forces that needed to be tamed. He claims that because the Crusaders took a step back for every sin they did, they would fall off the cliff if they had too much sin. Then, as the two make their way back to the monastery, They discuss the progress of the investigation into Michael's death. Grace believes Mother Superior washed her brother's body to destroy any evidence, but Harris explains that the body was washed out of respect for Michael and that the act had already been reported to the investigator. After that, Father Romero gives Grace a box belonging to Michael, which contains the diary written in a symbolic M language. Grace says that she can read it because it is a language she and Michael created many years ago. Michael mentions in the diary that Grace has no memory of her childhood before being adopted into the family, and that she can see supernatural occurrences. Suddenly, Grace has another childhood vision when her father becomes stranded in a storm and dies. Grace is frightened when a police officer arrives to inform her of this. She then desperately prays to God for the return of her father, and a few minutes later, her father appears behind her, although he seems angry for having to come there. Meanwhile, Father Romero is arguing with the nuns in the monastery. Mother Superior wants to abduct Grace because she believes she is evil, but Father Romero swears he will handle it. Moments later, Grace hears a nun shouting for help outside, so she walks outdoors. She then sees a nun named Meg running in fear and decides to follow her, who is seen slashing herself in penance. But seconds later, Meg reappears behind Grace completely fine, and it turns out to be Grace's vision. Meg then admits that this is her secret retreat and that she feels awful about herself. However, Grace assures Meg that she's a nice person and asks for a phone from her. After that, Grace calls her friend Dr. John and informs him that she's having hallucinations. However, he notes that it could be due to her grievances about her brother's death. Just then, Mother Superior appears behind her and tells her that they are not her visions, but rather memories from the past and future. She then asks Grace to share her vision, but Grace declines to do so. The next day, Harris begins questioning Mother Superior about Michael's death. When asked why she washes Michael's body, she explains that it was done to make him presentable to God. However, the detective is skeptical that Mother Superior is capable of moving the body away from the beach alone. So Harris informs her that she may be in prison for removing the evidence. Meanwhile, when reading the diary, Grace continues to get flashbacks. Her father was never the same after he awoke from the dead. He accused Grace of being the devil, confining her and Michael in a cage and trying clumsy exorcism. Grace's mother tried to stop the maniac, but the man had lost his mind and ended up killing the poor woman. However, when he tried to kill Grace, something attacked him and knocked him out, and the police eventually captured him. Back in the present, Grace walks over to Father Romero, who is preparing for the consecration. She inquires about the Covenant's attempt to adopt her and her brother as children. Furthermore, Grace assumes that this is the reason why her brother visited the convent. But Father Romero believes Michael came to inquire about the missing 12th century relic. He reveals that this convent was storing a relic said to be the force of darkness, but during an earthquake in 1993, a portion of a convent cliff collapsed, claiming the crypt in which it was held. Father Romero said that he is rather relieved it is no longer there because he has never loved the Crusaders or their history. Then Father Romero gives Grace some books about the history of the relic and its connections to the Crusaders. This scene then shifts back to the time when little Grace and her brother were being taken to the monastery. On the way, the priest forcibly tosses Michael onto the road and tries to sedate Grace with chloroform. But suddenly, the car is involved in an accident and the priest dies on the spot. But Grace survives. Later, while reading about the relic, Grace has a vision of a little girl guarded by knights. She then wanders around the convent and has a vision of Father Carroll tormenting Michael. They want the relic back, but Michael has no idea where it is, and he has been hunting it as well. However, Mother Superior is certain that Michael is lying and orders the nuns to hurl him from the top. And as they try to do so, Michael unintentionally takes Father Carroll's rod and pokes him with it. Grace is terrified by the scene, but suddenly a nun shows up to attack her with a knife. However, a mysterious force intervenes and controls her hand, resulting in the nun stabbing herself to death. Next, Grace is questioned by Detective Harris regarding the death of the nun. It turns out that the nun she encountered earlier saw her brother's death. Grace says that the nun committed suicide, but Harris remains skeptical. After a day in jail, Grace is released on Father Romero's bail appeal, noting that the nun truly stabbed herself and that there is also a witness. Meanwhile, Harris is still keeping Mother Superior in detention. Afterward, Grace drives to the prison to see her father, who is detained. He is still enraged with his daughter for resurrecting him from the dead. He reveals how he discovered her when she was just 10 years old, wandering down the beach wet and frail. Just then, Grace informs him that Michael has died, but the man blames Grace for his death. He begins violently hammering on the glass door, believing Grace to be evil and demanding that she return Michael at any cost. At the station, Mother Superior informs Harris that Grace is the relic. Michael was aware of it, but because he didn't recognize the darkness in her, he refused to help and therefore suffered the price. Meanwhile, Grace returned to the monastery where the consecration is taking place. She walks inside looking for Father Romero, and the nuns appear to be terrified of her. One of the nuns tries to knife her to death, but an immense force prevents her from doing so. Meg is horrified to see this and flees screaming, and Grace recalls the vision in which Meg had cut herself. So Grace immediately rushes to the place to save Meg, but it turns out to be too late. At this point, Grace looks at the mirror and believes something is wrong with her and that her father was right. Now Grace finally enters the church to confess her sin, and Father Romero and the other nuns take her to the consecration chamber on their shoulders. There they finally consecrate her by placing her in a tomb. As the nuns sealed the tomb, Father Romero prepares a prayer. With this, Grace has more flashbacks of when she was a child captured by the Crusaders. These people kept her trapped in the crypt with biblical words that prevented her from aging. She went over 800 years without food or drink, but she escaped during the earthquake, and her adoptive father found her on the shore and brought her home. In the present, the demonic force rips the sword out of a statue and it falls to Father Romero, stabbing him in the back. Just then, Grace appears and asks him if burying was his plan all along and what happened to forgiveness. However, Father Romero replies that Grace died for the sins of mankind, not the fallen angel. Now Grace rushes out of the convent into the cliff where her brother was killed. She begs her brother's forgiveness and tries to jump off the cliff. Eris arrives barely in time to save her, but she still jumps from the cliff. It is then revealed that Grace actually has demonic power, but she appears to be oblivious to it. When the priest tried to kill her, her own force caused the car to crash. It was also her power that stopped the nun from stabbing her and shoved the blade toward Father Romero. The next day, Harris looks for Grace's body but fails to find it. He frees Mother Superior due to a lack of evidence, despite her insistence that Grace is still alive and that she must be stopped. Then we see Grace and John sharing a drink somewhere. Grace is alive, and she explains that she's undergoing counseling to overcome the traumas she has endured. Just then, John mentioned something odd about her patient. It turns out that when he saw the old lady, she had perfect eyesight, which was a miracle. We then see how Grace in her guardian angel guise cured that lady's eyesight. In the final scene, Mother Superior decides to personally confront and stop Grace. She appears outside Grace's workplace, pointing a gun at her, but an unexpected event occurs as she is hit and killed by a passing cab. Inside the cab, there is an angel bobblehead, and Grace mentions her belief in having a guardian angel since childhood. However, unbeknownst to Grace, the guardian angel is actually herself, a time-traveling demon nun who continuously protects her own existence